A man is locked behind the barred window of an asylum. He is not allowed outside at night. He is not allowed near open sky. And yet, from that locked room, he is about to paint the most famous night sky in the history of art. When he finishes it, he will call it a failure. This is the story of the Starry Night, and the darkness it actually came from. At first glance, the painting looks like peace itself. A quiet village sleeping beneath rolling hills, a thin church spire catching moonlight, stars wrapped in glowing halos, a moon the color of ripe lemon, and air that seems to move in slow, thick spirals above the rooftops. But look again. The sky is not resting. It is turning, pulsing, coiling in on itself, as if it might reach down and swallow the tiny houses below. And on the left side of the canvas, a black shape rises higher than anything else in the scene. A cypress tree, dark as a flame frozen mid-burn.
In the region where this was painted, cypress trees were planted in cemeteries. So what is actually happening in this sky? And what state of mind produced it? This is the Starry Night, painted by Vincent van Gogh in 1889, 1 year before his death. Oil on canvas, roughly 73 by 92 centimeters. Today it hangs in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, viewed by millions of people every year. Almost none of them know what the man who painted it was going through when he made it. Vincent van Gogh was born into the family of a preacher. As a young man, he tried preaching himself before turning to painting instead. During his lifetime, his work barely sold. Critics dismissed his thick, vivid brushstrokes as careless and crude, clumsy, almost childish, especially when compared to the polished painters of his era. He worked for years in near total rejection, producing painting after painting that almost nobody wanted.
In 1888, he moved south to the town of Arles in the south of France and rented a house that would later become famous, the Yellow House. He had a dream: to build a brotherhood of painters who would live and create together under one roof. He invited the painter Paul Gauguin to join him. At first, it worked. 2 artists, 1 house, shared meals, shared work. But Gauguin preferred to paint from memory and imagination. Vincent needed to paint from life, from what was directly in front of him. The disagreements between them grew sharper week by week, until they were arguing about almost everything. After one especially violent quarrel, in a fit of breakdown, Vincent cut off part of his own ear. A few months later, when he was admitted into psychiatric care, a doctor recorded in his file that the patient was suffering from acute mania, with visual and auditory hallucinations severe enough to drive him to mutilate himself. The townspeople of Arles were terrified. 30 residents signed a petition and delivered it to the mayor, demanding that this man be removed from the town, sent back to his family, or locked away in an asylum. The town turned its back on him. He was forced to leave the Yellow House behind. And it was this exact moment, rejection, isolation, and collapse, that pushed him toward the painting that would outlive him by more than a century. On the 8th of May, 1889, accompanied by a local pastor, Vincent checked himself into the Saint-Paul-de-Mausole asylum, a few kilometers outside the town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. The pastor later wrote to Vincent's brother, Théo, a Paris art dealer who supported Vincent financially and kept sending him canvas and paint, describing how calm Vincent had been.
He explained his own condition to the director of the asylum himself, the pastor said, like a man who fully understood exactly what was happening to him. Nobody forced him there. He asked to be admitted because he no longer trusted himself to live alone. The asylum wasn't built like a prison. It was a former monastery, surrounded by olive groves and pine-lined paths. Patients were treated, in the language of the time, with gentleness and goodwill. No chains, no restraints, just labour, routine, and quiet distraction. Vincent described his new room to Theo in detail. Greenish-grey wallpaper, 2 sea-green curtains patterned with faint roses, an old armchair covered in a mismatched, faded fabric. Twice a week he was given 2-hour baths, which he said calmed him considerably. And through the barred window of his room, facing east, he could see a wheat field, a distant ridge of hills, and, early in the morning, long before sunrise, a sky holding a single, solitary morning star. Here is the detail almost nobody expects. Vincent could not actually paint the Starry Night from that view. He wasn't allowed outside after dark, and the studio he was given, 1 floor below, only accessible during daylight hours, faced a garden. No mountains, no open sky at all. So he built the painting from pieces. He took the outline of the hills from one canvas he had already painted. He took the cypress trees from another, and the whirling, spiralling sky above all of it, the part everyone remembers, he painted entirely from memory and imagination, in broad daylight, inside a room with no view of the stars whatsoever. The first thing that blocks the sky is the cypress. Almost black, it cuts across the front of the canvas and climbs upward like a tongue of flame. Cypress trees lined the entire valley where he lived, planted there since Roman times, used as windbreaks, and also, traditionally, as the trees of graveyards. Vincent was obsessed with them. "The cypresses are always occupying my thoughts," he wrote to his brother. He compared their shape to Egyptian obelisks and wanted to paint them the way no one ever had. Some scholars have looked at that lone, dark tree standing apart from everything else in the composition and seen something more than a tree. The painting was made a year before Vincent died. It isn't hard to imagine an artist who felt rejected and misunderstood, recognizing something of himself in that single, awkward, towering shape rising above the rest of the scene. There's also a trace of home hidden in the painting. The church spire, narrow, sharp, pointed, doesn't actually match the architecture of that region of France. It looks more Dutch than Provençal, closer to the church towers Vincent used to paint years earlier in his home village in the Netherlands. Because of this, some call it the first of his Memories of the North, a Dutch village quietly folded into a southern landscape, under a sky that belongs to neither place. For more than 100 years, researchers have argued about whether there is a hidden religious meaning buried in that sky. Vincent grew up the son of a preacher and once tried preaching himself. And in this particular sky, the moon and stars are surrounded by enormous glowing halos. In religious painting, a halo is a mark of holiness. It's how artists for centuries painted the heads of Christ, the Virgin Mary, the prophets. Now count the stars. In one influential reading of the composition, there are 11 of them, though depending on how you count, what's a star,
what's part of the swirling sky, and what's simply light around the moon, that number shifts depending on who's counting. Still, some scholars have pointed to this possible count of 11 and heard an echo of an old story from the book of Genesis. Joseph, dreaming that the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bow down before him. Joseph, the outcast, betrayed by his own 11 brothers, who spent years locked away before his fortunes turned. It isn't difficult to imagine why an artist rejected by his fellow painters and locked away far from home might have felt some kinship with that particular story. Joseph believed that one day his brothers, his own stars, would bow to him. Was Vincent quietly encoding the same kind of hope about his own future? And yet Vincent himself flatly denied any religious intention behind these paintings. In a letter to his brother, he described this body of work as having nothing to do with a return to romantic or religious ideas. What he wanted, following the example of the painter Delacroix, whom he deeply admired, was to express nature through colour, a nature purer than the suburbs and taverns of Paris. He was openly critical of Gauguin and another painter, Bernard, for leaning too heavily on biblical scenes, calling it, in his own words, a kind of violence against nature. He didn't want to paint scripture. He wanted to paint what he actually saw and felt. But stars, for Vincent, were never simply decoration in the sky. As early as 1888, he had written about a starry sky as something that could only be called God and eternity. While reading Victor Hugo's account of the Franco-Prussian War, he noted that there was still hope in the world. Hope, he wrote, that lives in the stars. He went further, reasoning that Earth itself is a planet, which means Earth itself is, in some sense, also a star. And if that's true, he wondered, what if every other star out there is the same, a place, a possibility, a kind of home? These same ideas, stars, love, eternity, echoed something he found in the poetry of Walt Whitman, whom he urged his friends to read. The same vision of a divine kind of love poured out across an endless universe. Among all the lights on that canvas, one stands apart. A large, bright white star sits right beside the cypress tree. This morning I saw the countryside from my window a long time before sunrise, with nothing but the morning star, Vincent wrote. That morning star is Venus. An art historian named Albert Boime once built an entire investigation around that single line. Working with colleagues at an observatory, they reconstructed the pre-dawn sky exactly as it would have appeared outside that asylum window on that specific morning, turning back the clock more than a century. Venus really was there, glowing low on the horizon, bright and white, exactly where Vincent said he saw it. Which means the sky in the Starry Night isn't pure invention. It grew out of a real sky, glimpsed through a real barred window. Everything else, the spirals, the swirling currents, the burning moon, that part came entirely from his imagination. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn, into physics. In 2024, scientists from China and France published a study examining this same sky, uncovering something Vincent himself could never have known. To understand it, you first need to understand turbulence, the chaotic movement you see in rivers, in smoke, in storm clouds. Large swirls of motion break down into smaller ones according to a strict mathematical pattern, a law that a Soviet mathematician named Andrei Kolmogorov worked out only in the 1940s, more than 50 years after Vincent had already died. The research team took a digital image of the Starry Night, measured the 14 major swirls across the sky, their size, their spacing, their intensity, and found that they follow this exact mathematical law. One of the lead researchers explained it simply. Imagine standing on a bridge, staring down at a moving river. The eddies on the surface look random, chaotic, unpredictable, but they aren't. They fall into strict, calculable patterns. The team didn't stop at the large swirls. They also studied the tiniest brushstrokes scattered in between them and found that these smallest marks follow a second physical law entirely, the same law that describes how flowing currents scatter light particles, like dust drifting through air or algae drifting through water. Vincent, of course, knew none of these equations. The scientists themselves are careful about drawing too strong a conclusion. Perhaps, they suggest, he simply spent so many hours staring at flowing water, moving air and shifting sky that the underlying physics somehow imprinted itself into his hand without him ever knowing the mathematics behind it. One researcher called it a remarkable coincidence. An artist mocked in his own time for sloppy, careless brushwork is now studied by physicists, because inside those very brushstrokes he had somehow captured a structure that science still struggles to fully describe, even today. And despite all of this, Vincent himself never considered the Starry Night a masterpiece. He barely wrote about it. In his own letters, he described it flatly, almost dismissively, as simply another study of a starry sky. When the canvas eventually reached Paris, his brother Theo responded with noticeable reserve. No mention of the cypress, no mention of the hills, no mention of the strange spirals overhead. Theo referred to it simply as a village under moonlight, and remarked, more generally, that chasing after style can damage a painter's true feeling for things. Later, Vincent came to count the Starry Night among his own failures. "I let myself get carried away, reaching for stars that are too big," he admitted in a letter, a line that reads almost like an apology for the very painting the world would later can't stop looking at. The painting the entire world now admires was, to the man who made it, a mistake. And it wasn't born out of any kind of peace. In those same months at the asylum, his illness kept returning, wave after wave. On his worst days, the very paint he used to build that glowing sky became something dangerous in his own hands. After one such episode, his paints were taken away from him and his studio was locked. "Not being able to enter the room where I'm allowed to paint is almost unbearable," he wrote. And that painting he considered a failure would go on to become one of the most recognized images ever made, because the calm it gives to millions of people was invented by a man who had none of it himself. He painted a sky he could never actually find in his own life.